we're definitely heading towards a reality where there is sort of augmentation. There is certainly aspects of our sport at which the computer can already do better.
But there's a rule specifically to stop America's Cup boats being sailed by a computer. So what is AI actually doing on these boats, and where does it stop?
Even as a technologist, I don't want to get to that point where we've written the humans out of the script.
That's Nick Holroyd. He's been designing America's Cup boats for the last 30 years, and right now he's head of design for the British entry GB1. Now, this team has recently announced a partnership with an AI company called Physics X. And of course, everybody is announcing partnerships with AI companies at the moment, but this is actually being used right now to design the boats. And before this Cup is out, we could potentially be seeing this system on board during a race. So I sat down and I asked Nick everything. What it was that the system can and can't do, what the rules limit it in doing, and of course, I had to ask him whether the computer was already better than the sailors themselves. And along the way, Nick even took the time to explain a little bit of what it was that New Zealand were doing better than anybody else in the last Cup. Here's Nick Holroyd. So one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you was because of this announcement that you guys have put out about physics AI, and obviously the whole world is awash with the AI buzz. I'm just curious as to what does it mean? Are the boats going to be thinking for themselves? Are you going to be bringing in better computers? I mean, what really does this allow you to do?
Well, I'll start with what it's not, and it's not, name your favourite, frontier model LLM and ask it to design a faster boat. It's not that.
What a pity.
Well, we use all those, clearly we use all those tools for accessing data better and all of those kind of things, right? But they're 100% folded up in your workflow. But the sort of Physics X partnership is around how do we use sort of advanced machine learning models to better describe the physics of the boat. And the second thing is that inference modelings, these inference models that solve on a GPU and what have you, are incredibly fast. You're talking, time to return a set of force and moments off a sail plan, for example, is in fractions of a second, where the CFD behind that takes tens of hours, right? And so you have this kind of shift in speed and shift in magnitude in that sense. And those are all the things that we're after in our world.
So what I'm envisaging, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I'm envisaging somebody in the team saying, maybe the boat would be faster if actually that little component was pointed rather than round or flipped up or flipped down, or it was this shape. And you can say, well, let's ask this physics AI model, and it will do thousands and thousands of tests and refine to a point where it gives you a reliable answer?
If I could take one step back, we've all been using what in engineering you would call a surrogate modelling technique to describe these boats for a long time, right? When we build a physics model of the boat, okay, it's a mechanical model with all, forces on the sails, forces on the foils, the weight of the boat, all these things need to balance in equilibrium, and we use an optimizer solver to find that balance. You don't know ahead of time where the boat is going to balance, right? So if we look at the aerodynamic problem, for example, we're balancing the foil forces against effectively the sail plan. If we look at that aerodynamic problem, the problem you have is you do not know where the boat is going to solve ahead of time, right? So we would solve a bunch of CFD problems across space. Then we need to create what we call the surrogate model, which is a kind of smooth mathematical representation of all of that data. That is something that the boat model can kind of search across for an optimal combination of, you name it, the height the boat is flying at, the windward heel the boat has, the bow down trim it has, how much main sheet it has, how much Cunningham it has, et cetera, right? So we create this sort of smooth mathematical representation. And we've been doing this for 10 years and maybe long before it was called AI. But then what's happened now is the scale of these models has grown enormously. And the second thing that's happening is we can start to embed native kind of physics into these models as well, right? So we can sort of say, here's a bunch of data that you need to fit that describes our sail plan, for example. But also while you're fitting that, you need to respect the laws of fluid dynamics, right? So we can kind of code those equations into the AI model as well, right? So you can start to do things that are kind of less naive in the way that you build your surrogate model. So that's sort of step one.
Right, so we're moving beyond, here's 4 points on a line, fill that line in. Now, if I ask you what's happening in between those points, you can give me a rough thing. Where now you're describing, we can ask this model, here's the laws of nature, read this book on Newton, read this book on Bernoulli, right, okay, now you've got that, now let me ask you a question. So it's
exactly. So that the shape of the curve through those 4 points will have some kind of underlying physical meaning to it, right? So if we impose the kind of background physics in the form of differential equations or what have you in the training of the model, then those can reinforce and force that curve into a more meaningful shape for us. So that's step one. The second thing we can start to do with AI is clearly automation, right? And so if you look at, if I can sort of describe the complexity of the problem here, I mentioned, the height of the boat above the water, the heel of the boat, the bow down pitch of the boat. Then in the rig plan, we have, jib sheet, main sheet, traveller, jib car, Cunningham's, outhauls, etc. Right? There's another 10 odd variables in that space. If you said, I need 3 points in each of those dimensions to give me some idea of the shape of the data, and then you take those 12, 13, whatever dimensions you want to include in your model, you're talking 3 to the 13 as a number is just an astronomically large number to try and build the model, right? And so
you can't give that to the work experience kid to do over the weekend. That's a big task.
Well, we don't. There's not enough compute in the world to go and run all that CFD, right? So we have to. This is where we sort of start to get intelligent about the way we decompose the problem and how we do it. And so the things we can start to do with really clever machine learning algorithms is do a scatter of points across that 13-dimensional space, solve the boat model in that scatter of points, look at where it's solving, and then have the model decide, well, actually, there's quite a high uncertainty where I've just solved this point. So I'll calculate where the optimal position is to add more points to give myself the most accuracy in the corner of that space that I'm happen to be solving right now. And as the model and our design evolves, that model continues to kind of learn and generate more points for itself and what have you. So there's some fantastic opportunities in the way you can use it to manipulate data. The flip side is we then go out in the water and we collect a lot of data and we use that data to validate and check the state of the model. So you kind of end up with these two loops that are sort of reinforcing. That's an area that allows you to drive sort of performance out of the boat during the testing season.
And where does this stop? Where do you have to unplug this powerful tool and go, right now we've just got to hit the water and go for it? Are we still able to, is it just on the design? Can you do it in terms of, oh no, you want a bit more outhaul there? Actually, if we gave the Cunningham a yank at this point, it would really benefit us. And if that is the case, I mean, are we using this when racing? I mean, all I'm saying is, at what point do you have to ask the big, powerful supercomputer to sit this one out?
Obviously, boats got to be at a certain weight and what have you. So you're not lugging 7,000 cores of compute cluster around behind you. But and that's the beauty of these kind of AI models. They're computationally expensive to train. So we take these huge data sets and obviously we're sort of putting them onto very large GPU clusters, et cetera, to take all that data and fit the model. But once you've fitted the model and you have the weights in your neural net or whatever architecture that is, the evaluation of them is actually relatively light and very, very quick. And so, yes, you can move these trained models onto the yacht and have them running. So yeah, that's a fundamentally a work in progress, right? How much of that can we use?
That is an avenue that you are actively exploring to say, well, once we've trained this computer so it knows, so the system knows, it will be able to give us these answers. you can put that onto the boat.
You're certainly in an environment at that point where you can evaluate those questions real time, and that, again, that's the beauty of this thing.
And so what does that mean? What does that mean rules wise? So the boat's not allowed to have the ability for somebody on the coach boat or somebody on the shore to control systems. You're not allowed to input to the boat over a
Correct.
link. There is a link because obviously we get to watch the footage, we get to see the heart rates, we get to see some of the data that's coming off. So I'm guessing if you want to have computing power there, it has to be on the boat, right? So in my head, I've got, Dylan Fletcher saying, computer, should I turn faster or slower for this, jibe at the top? And the computer will say, boop, do this. Obviously that's that's farcical, but how far away, what is the reality?
We're definitely heading towards a reality where there is sort of augmentation, put it that way. And the ability to guide the actions of the crew in some way. That's definitely a thing. Yeah, there are constraints on board the boat, right? We're not allowed to measure sail shapes, for example.
Yes.
In real
and
time.
This has been a rule that's been there for a while. You can't, in the yacht state, you can't say, the computer can't say, I'm this high, I'm this heeled, I'm this, it can't measure where it is and then make decisions. There has to be a human breaking that chain somewhere, correct?
Exactly that. But you can train models with a lot of data, and they can have a pretty good guess based on various inputs that we are roughly in this state, and kind of move on from there.
So you're saying that you can train your AI model, you can feed it all this information, you can have it sort of learn, compute all its thing with this big GPUs, all the units going away, all the whirring. Then when you've got something that's good, you can condense that small enough to actually put on the boat, and it becomes a tool that the sailors could conceivably use in some way.
Yeah, that's not new. I think the idea of running the boat model and having it compute states that we can't otherwise measure, kind of infer states that we're not allowed to measure under the rules, and running the boat model in the background is not a new concept. It's the scale with which you can start to do that that's really interesting.
But ultimately, it becomes a pretty powerful tool to have a computer on your shoulder, as long as if you can tell it how high you are, what state you are, where the sails are, the computer can say, well, this is what I'd suggest. And then the sailor can carry it out.
Yeah, fundamentally, that's the sort of expert guidance type of thing, right? Is absolutely part of the picture here, and will be a feature of this cup, I think. Then the class rule enforces very sort of strict divisions about where information is allowed to flow through the boat. And in fact, that's sort of enforced by what's called the media center. So when we measure wind speed, or we measure ride height, or we measure boat attitude and stuff, all of that is passed first through the media center and then onto our systems. Some of that's delayed, so that by putting a delay in there, they make it impossible for us to try and do an autopilot to fly the boat, for example. So it sort of enforces the manual crew skill aspects of what we do.
Has anybody found a clever way past it? I've seen different ways of sailing the boats. One person's just sort of turning a dial, other person's looking out over the side. I'm wondering whether anybody you think has found a way around that rule, or at least a way to kind of keep the computer.
I think that I've got to acknowledge that I think the Kiwis did a very good job of exploiting some of that last time, in terms of levels of sort of sequencing through maneuvers and so on and so forth. That I think they probably led the pack there, and arguably you would say the biggest difference between ourselves and the Kiwis in the match was the performance through those maneuvers. So it's an interesting area for sure.
Well, when you say sequencing, this is essentially the computer pulling certain things on, turning things off as you sort of go through a maneuver, as you sort of go through it's a process that kind of runs. But how did they do it? What did they do that was smart?
First off, you need a set of tools in the background at a design level that let you optimize what those sequences might be. What speed should we be dropping the foil arm? What speed should we be transferring lift from the old foil to the new foil? How fast should we be turning the boat? How much main sheet should we be easing into the maneuver? Where should the traveller land as we come out? All of these things, you need a framework to be able to optimize that, to know what you're really trying to do in the first instance. And then once you're kind of there, you're into how do we affect that in a controlled sense.
I mean, the possibilities are a little bit endless. You could go in a million different directions with this. Time's your enemy in this game, and actually, it's kind of the thinking fast, thinking slow problem, right? The guys on board the boat are thinking fast, and how do you feed things? We have the luxury of sitting here in the office for 2 years, pondering this boat, to think really slowly, right, and think really deeply, right? So how do we? In some ways, this modelling is about distilling that very slow, deep thinking that we've got in the background, and how do you put that in the hands of the guys that have to act fast and think fast? And that's that probably describes the problem quite well. So here's a hypothetical for you. If the rules allowed, if we had a deed of gift match in the future, it sounds as if the first question you'd ask is, do the rules allow us to not have sailors on board? You're training the computer to be able to process information at a level that a human being can't, or certainly get distracted from doing. I guess what I'm asking is, theoretically, could we see a point where, just like in chess, a computer is better at making these decisions than a human?
I think there is certainly aspects of our sport at which the computer could already do better. And this is a really interesting space. We're talking about class rules for future cups and things right now, right? What should our sport look like? What is the value of the human element in the sport? What is the value of the technology in our sport? The cup's always been this technology pinnacle and stuff, but at a very personal level, I tune in to watch a tennis match to see the temperament of the human, to see all of these human aspects, right? So, and so this is a very personal view. Even as a technologist, I don't want to get to that point where we've written the humans out of the script. There are undoubtedly sort of sensory things that humans have, understanding the environment and being able to see breeze on the water, being able to understand just the seat of the pants thing, right, of the boat and the motion of the boat, et cetera, where I think where the humans are still undoubtedly in the loop. Yeah, I think that's a very important philosophical question. What do people want to see in this sport? It's so complex, so multifaceted. I think it's a very key question.